Besides foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly.
Broadcast from later, we gather and share and discuss and rate the relevance of weak signals of change, aka stuff we notice that we suspect represents significant future shifts. We don't know anything. I'm Robert Bolton, joined today by Asia Clark, Balder Simmons, Macy Sue, Erica White, and Radha Mystery from the Autodesk Foresight practice. Hey, Radha.
Hi.
What's your weakest signal?
I knew you were going to pick me first. I don't know if this is my weakest, but I can't get it out of my head. So it's around ancient scriptures for the digital age. And there's this woman named Vaishnavi Murthy, and she learned of this script called Tulu, which is from the state of Karnataka in India. And she learned of it from her grandfather, but it wasn't something that she saw in Sanskrit-based scriptures. She didn't see it in any other kind of South Indian dialects. And she ended up going into graphic design when she when she went to university and stuff like that. And the further and further she got into graphic design and kind of digital representation, the more she realized that there are, which I think we're all aware of, there are all of these languages and these ancient scriptures that we're losing because of this translation to digital, through kind of having to translate things through the Unicode system. And so she's been working for basically the last 2 decades to digitize the Tulu script into a proposal that'll be, approved by the Unicode Consortium. But the problem is that lots of computers and smartphones are basically built for the Roman alphabet, and for languages that have complex writing systems that don't necessarily have the same Western-based logic, it becomes really difficult for the kind of Unicode standard to kind of be open enough to accept scripts that aren't necessarily represented by a single consistent form. The thing that was kind of interesting here for me, because we've seen this in other display languages for computers and smartphones and things like that, was that we're really talking about this wider homogenization of culture. And I think there's 2 sides of the same coin, where we say hey, the internet is really interesting and it allows us to kind of be open to all of these different cultures and have a better understanding of what's happening, but beyond our immediate proximity. But at the same time, tapping into the digital arena and wanting to communicate through our kind of virtual and digital systems is basically disappearing a lot of the languages and a lot of the ancient cultures and rituals and kind of just ways of being that have been preserved for millennia. This script has been around for 2,000 years.
So this is a script. It's essentially a written language, right? A way of representing information with something like characters, right? Okay. And so there's a lot of stuff written in Tulu, is it called?
Tulu.
Tulu.
Yeah.
Tulu. Tulu. So there's a lot of stuff written in this from a specific time in India.
Yeah, exactly.
And what's the nature of the content? It's sacred texts, or what's the what is it that she's looking at?
I mean, it's everything. It was when India was colonized and there were German missionaries coming over, they tried to use Tulu as a way to translate some of the content from the Bible and stuff like that. Today it's only spoken by around almost 2 million people, which in a country of 1 billion people is not that much.
Right.
But what you end up losing in folks not being able to recognize the language or understand it anymore is it's not just about religious scripture. There's all of these different regional ethnic practices and rituals and just parts of cultural identity that are being kind of swept away. And then the kind of conflict with the Unicode Consortium is that your baseline cost to entry is around $20,000 US. So when you have these very niche groups who are advocating for languages to be encoded into a digital system, but you have, Silicon Valley giants like Facebook and Google and Microsoft and all those folks who really do still kind of hold the reins for what makes it in and what doesn't. What we're seeing is the homogenization of language and culture over time.
Beyond that cost barrier, is there something lost even in if you do figure out how to transliterate it using Unicode? Or
yeah, because the way that the system was originally set up was based on a Western model of language, right? And so there's limitations for things that that have more kind of complex and by like the Roman alphabet standards, like inconsistent forms of, written expression. And so my question is like, how many cultures do we end up losing? Like what parts of ritual and culture and practice do we end up losing by tapping into our digital identities?
Yeah, I feel like with languages in general, there's like languages like the sort of the constraints and flexibility of languages like English and French and Spanish and so on are uniquely like suited for keyboards and so on, but it can be a lot more difficult with other languages, like pictographic ones or whatever.
Right. And when you have like character-based languages, like even with like Hindi and with Sanskrit, it's like the way that you can kind of like pull apart parts of a character to give that sound to another, like, a part of a vowel to another consonant or whatever it is. Right. So like those rules don't necessarily mimic the way we think about like the A to Z alphabet.
Sure. Yeah. Does anyone have a lot of experience working on their computer in something like another language like Hindi or Chinese or whatever? And like, what's that's like? Mine's quite minimal.
Yeah. I mean, I find it really hard in general for Chinese inputs. Well, me personally, in terms of like typing it, I always have to like do the handwritten style. But then obviously, I guess like Chinese has more standardization now in terms of recognizing it.
I mean, that's an interesting thing with Chinese too, right? Like I've been studying, like the more standardization now also results in like a lot is lost from the past, just in common usage or whatever.
It's not necessarily an old problem. I mean, a new problem, right? Because we look at like Old English and we look at like Shakespearean novels and things like no one speaks like that anymore. But I think the thing that's different here, or what feels different, is that the scale at which this is happening feels so much more kind of amplified, potentially.
I'm reminded that like one of the most remarkable communication innovations and progress that we've had is translation, right? It's like translation has got so good over the course of our lives from like nothing, right? With like Google Translate and these things and the camera features on it and so on. And as has like speech to text. And so I wonder, like with these, like should we not be figuring out like, are they accounting for enough nuance, or are they accounting for a wide enough diversity of languages?
I don't know, but I mean, like, there's so much controversy even just around like Squid Games and the dubbed version versus the subtitled version versus like the actual Korean version, and how much nuance and just like translation was lost. So I think there's something to be said about like, what do we lose in the translation of these things?
And for you, what do you think it'll mean futures-wise?
I think it's two sides of the same coin, where like on one level, you have a better understanding of what's happening in different cultures around the world because you have access to it through your mobile devices. But on the other hand, I think we have to be very wary of how entire cultures can kind of disappear, and just kind of this overall like homogenization of culture when you opt into the digital realm.
The thing with translation that always comes to mind for me as well, I guess, is like Rob mentioned, if there's like keyboards being kind of developed specific to that language, or even something more pictographic where it's like not Zulu, but the process of how an emoji goes through a process of getting verified or even made and then used by like the Unicode system. There's all those different little moments that a community has to go through to get like, language onboarded into a full system, like a digital system, like you were mentioning in the beginning. So I'd be curious to know what could come of like an older language with that kind of weight and cultural history behind it. If there's something there that could arise out of it, like it's hard to know because I haven't seen the actual script, but what kind of play could happen with the language as well in the digital system and it integrating into a digital system, I guess.
I also wonder like if there's an inflection point where we reach where there are so many endangered languages like this that it really drives like a new way of thinking about how our systems are designed, our keyboards are designed. If there's enough of a shift to where we kind of see the rest of the world saying like, hey, there's a new way forward for the way we design these mechanisms.
Like topographically, what gets included is standardized to a certain degree. So that brings in a richer layer of detail to a UX, I think.
Yeah, and whether like the digitization of the language like honors the way the language is structured and formed. Because like in Chinese, for example, there's a very specific way to like the strokes of the characters, the way that it's written. And yeah, because it is like pictorial in nature. And sometimes like that's completely lost when you're typing or the input method is different. So it'll be interesting to see like how that experience can be translated digitally as well.
A friend of mine sent me like this article about this British Ghanaian entrepreneur who came up with some technology it's called Click, where it's like a wireless earbud that instantly translates over 40 languages. So like you would have the headbuds in and somebody could be speaking to you in a different language and then you would hear it in the language in which you are used to speaking. And I feel like maybe this signal paired with something like that represents an opportunity for, I'm not sure what the entrance like barriers would be for like a language that maybe having less people speak it over generations, but that could be an opportunity for preservation. But something else that I was thinking about too was languages represent ways of thinking, not even just ways of talking, but also ways of thinking. And I don't know if or how ways of thinking can be codified, or like the way in which people orient themselves toward life through language can ever really be captured in code.
Rolling off of that, the controversy, I guess, behind the preservation of languages. Exactly, we've mentioned what has been preserved and how it's been preserved, but then also when it is, and if it is preserved to a certain degree, who can access it? Is it in like a museum, or the hope is that it would be open source and what have you, but
I remember Valdez talking to one time about just translation and how like that stuff's been going so well. And the obvious sort of like, I guess like Adorno take would be like, we're only getting dumber. We're not trying as hard to learn as many. But like what seems to have happened is like everyone's on Duolingo. People are more excited than ever about learning new languages and about language in general. And I think it's interesting too, even like right here, everybody seems to see this as like, oh, the opportunity for preservation as opposed to, like it's, and people are learning these. That's also something that's been happening. Like Duolingo has like Gaelic and these old languages and stuff like that on there. I'm not sure if there's any Sanskrit on Duolingo, but
There's Hindi on Duolingo.
there's Hindi for sure. Yeah. Anyway, Valdez.
I once brought up this like thing around like Duolingo. I don't think it works this way anymore, but the person who founded it is the guy who started CAPTCHA, the different like ways of basically utilizing like a moment where you're trying to prove that you're a human to actually, all that stuff actually goes into training image recognition algorithms. So you actually turn that little moment that was like, otherwise you would call like a wasted moment or something, into something that was like useful for certain kinds of companies who would buy up that label data and whatnot. But then he did a similar thing with Duolingo where it was like, realizing that you don't actually need like an expert instructor to teach a language. What you need is just two people who are interested in learning each other's languages. And so basically, this is how it was set up initially. I'm not sure about now because it's like gone public and whatever, it has different incentives. But like when it was set up, it was supposed to be that translations always had this issue of like, what's the universal standard or whatever. That's why UN documents were always used so often to try to train language algorithms back in the day. But it has this problem of like, where do you find the material to like make all of these translations? But if you can just set peers up, that was the idea, which to me is like fascinating because it's like, I guess as Radha said, like, there's a homogenizing force, but there's always like these things at the edges. Like anytime you make something very homogeneous, like even English, right? It's like a strangely global language, but by that very fact, at its edges, it is constantly becoming something different. There's so many like pidgin type languages out there that like are used in different cross sections that borrow from different languages that have different structures. I feel like the internet like catalyzes a lot of that kind of stuff. So those are like two different points. The third thing I'll know is just that Unicode idea that I think Erica, you brought up like a second ago, actually made me think about how like certain languages get very stagnant when they're formally administered. Like French, with the Académie Française is like it's just like any new word needs to be approved, any like formal grammatical thing needs to change. And I was just thinking like, how does change get introduced into different scripts if they're now managed by like a Unicode consortium? Like how does like a letter disappear or something like that, or get merged, like obviously grammatical rules can change all the time, but at the character level, it is like a very interesting question of like what happens with that and what happens to languages that are not, because they're not economically backed or what have you. What are the criteria for like what makes the cut is like interesting. It's also very early. That's also what I would add.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, who are the voting members of the Unicode Consortium?
The folks who are part of it right now are like the folks who run Silicon Valley. And then there are smaller groups. It's supposed to be like a nonprofit group, but there's a fee for membership. But the people that are going to have the most influence are going to be the folks that have kind of the most ability and access, right, to opt in. And then there are these little like niche groups with, you know, teams of like 5 people who are like, there's this ancient script that I want to preserve, and here's a proposal, and how do we go through with it? But it's the consortium that decides on like what our emoji keyboard looks like, or like what the Chinese character keyboard looks like. And the interesting thing for me is like, even in our emoji kind of keyboard, there's already symbols in there where I'm like the handshake symbol, where it's like there's only a white person version of that, right? Yeah. And so like it seems kind of like trivial, but when you start to think about it, where are the opportunities to diversify or to kind of like have it be something that's not so standardized and a little bit more open? And then what does that mean for the way that we interact with one another? Kind of related, but something that makes me like optimistic about this as we move forward is like K-pop stans coming together to learn Korean just because they really like BTS or something. And so there's like all these like interesting kind of like learning communities coming on board and like preserving language in their own way just because. And I'm wondering if like parts of that spirit kind of find their way into things like this, where it's like people just, the Thulu script thing is kind of a passion project for this woman. Like I look at like Sanskrit and I have, Sanskrit might as well be Latin to me. Like I have no idea what it says. I don't understand any of it, but it's like, when you get married, you say all of the rituals are spoken in Sanskrit, right? And you're like relying on the priest to like translate that stuff for you. And so how do we ensure that like those rituals and those practices, and Asia, to your point, like those ways of thinking and kind of like structuring meaning about the way we live and like how we exist in the world, like how does that stuff get translated in the digital realm?
It kind of reminds me of kind of the preservation behind Urdu. And that, yeah, there was a big push for it to be included in standardized keyboards and by more fixed systems like Apple OS or Android, and how it would be included because of the calligraphy behind it and the way, I guess, the language is written. I guess it doesn't actually fit to how you would type technically. So it's like, it also changes that mechanism where that like, sometimes a language can shift how you even think of typing or interacting with a digital thing as well.
That's kind of interesting though, because it makes me think about like the way that design aesthetic has changed over time as we've used digital tools. Like in architecture, when you go from drawing something by hand versus like using Maya or Rhino, you're kind of limited by how much you know about that tool, how well versed you are in it, and like what the capabilities are of the digital tool, right? Not to bring it back to like an Autodesk thing, I apologize. I just realized I did that. It's like, but it is interesting because like if you, but if you look at like, you know, things that were designed like pre-parametric modeling and then post, it's all because of the access to the digital tools that we had and like the translation mechanisms for that design language.
Yeah, you kind of have to be a good artist to be a good calligrapher and vice versa type situation.
This reminds me of this episode I just watched, Explained, when they were talking about time and how people's understanding and orientation to time is also codified in the way that they write. I guess Hebrew, like English or like I guess Latin languages, we read things left to right, but Hebrew is right to left. And then in Chinese it's like top to bottom. And that also implies how people think about their existence in space-time. And that also made me think about like people orient themselves around 2 sets of time through their language. I'm not sure if it's like the whole Islamic calendar or if it's just what time it is in Iran. It's like the year 1443 in Iran right now. But, you know, for the rest of the world or in the Western world paradigm, it's 2021. So language also codifies our understanding of where we are in space-time. This is another kind of aside, but I feel like that also is something that gets lost in translation when you're bringing things into a digital space.
No, totally. I was watching something similar where depending on the language, because of the left to right reading, figures will get placed in certain ways. So like Adam will be placed on the left, Eve will be placed on the right in some languages, and vice versa, depending on which way you're reading that text. So it does hold true to the translation from image to text.
So signal and noise, Erica.
I'm going to say signal because I think language is one of those things that has that capacity to bring meaning and purpose into new spaces and new spheres in a way that I think that's like almost a bit of what language does, is it causes those shifts and those bounces between people and communities. And so to see like an ancient language or like an older language revive itself and what that means to a community is interesting to me, and how it's able to circulate or how people are able to participate in that language digitally and otherwise is really fascinating to me as well.
I feel that language is always a signal for me. Asia, what do you think? Signal and noise?
I think it's a signal because I feel like there's an overarching theme in a lot of socio-political conversations and movements right now where people are concerned with preserving culture. I think that's like a thing that I read about in a way almost every single day in different ways. So I'm gonna say it's a signal.
Macy?
I like the signal aspect of how it's like a graphic designer's passion project being able to bring larger access or like revived interest in like an ancient language in the digital age. I guess I would like to see it as a signal of like more independent or artists or everyday people with an interest in older languages or endangered languages in using their own skills or their own passions or their own remixing of tools to bring it back to the wider public.
Yeah, I think there's something there right now with like language that it's like maybe hard to put a finger on exactly what the signal is, but like there's some things happening that we discussed here in this conversation that like together feel like this is different than anything that's occurred in the past. And it's like, it is the intersection of like language as a technology in itself and like digital technology. Valis, what do you think? Signal and noise.
I think I agree. I think everyone's on board. I think there's a question to me of like, does preservation require disconnection in some form? Like, does it have to be insulated in some way? You know, because these different, when you think like historically, these different scales of like creating standards in order to like facilitate connections across places, like it does have to be standardized. Does standardization mean homogenization? Maybe that's like a difference too. So it raises a lot of questions. For my own like preferred, like I don't know if this counts as like a signal, but for like a preferred thing, like I think the fact that people in different places are realizing that like their own historical languages and places that they come from like needs to like engage with digital technology in some way, I think is like very exciting, and like a space where actually like a lot of like, I don't want to use the word innovation, but like newness and creation, maybe those are better, can come from it, because it's not just like a business thing. It's like Chinese, when they introduced Chinese script to digital technologies, like the big thing was that obviously it doesn't have like the character-based form of like an alphabet, right? It has the iconographic like imagery stuff. So there's no way you can make like a keyboard with 5,000 characters or whatever. So what they started doing was like doing predictive text instead. And they got like incredible, well, I say they, but like Chinese researchers got incredibly accurate at it in like the 80s and 90s, way before anybody here was. And so what are those things that different languages bring to computing?
That sounds so homogenizing though, right? In terms of what people are saying, right? We don't know if you're using that predictive sort of text piece, right? It's like you're starting to form your constructions of what you're saying based on the likelihood that you're saying what it thinks.
But that's what language is.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm with you on that. Like, I don't know, the fluidity of language versus the bureaucratic standardization. I think of like language, alphabets, these are like the ultimate like core like frameworks that both like are generative and limiting, right? And really they don't feel that limiting in most cases to use, I guess, only by your own mastery or lack thereof in my case. But anyway, signal and noise for you?
Oh yeah, sure.
You said signal?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm with that. I mean, that part's the most intriguing to me. The passion of preservation piece that we've touched on, I think is definitely a single, but I also say, just to be a savage, I'll just say noise, because I think all our kids are going to be talking via emojis and memes only. Asia, what's your weakest signal?
Okay, I want to preface this signal by, I just don't want to yuck anybody's yum. Okay. But I was on the internet moving around and I found this website called This Foot Does Not Exist. It creates foot pictures as a chameleonic bimodal content using generative adversarial networks. The way I think about it is like two supercomputers fighting each other to figure out what would the best outcome be for what was requested by the person who put the input. And basically they come out with these very weird pictures of feet that like maybe don't look like feet, but are really, really strange, but they are feet. I thought it was really, really strange because I'm not really into feet, but then it put me down this rabbit hole of like how big feet are as like a different kind of nude. And This Foot Does Not Exist in particular is making computer generated nudes of feet, right? But feet are not just a nude to everybody. Feet are a nude to only people who have foot fetishes. So it's almost like a secret nude that's out in public. A foot picture could be a nude for somebody, but like a regular picture for somebody else. And you wouldn't quite know unless you're the person who knew that like, I'm seeing this foot and it's like kind of giving me a hard on right now. You know what I mean? So snooping around the internet, I also come across this website called WikiFeet, which has a lot of pictures of feet of different people and also feet of celebrities. So you can like go on there and see pictures of Eva Longoria's toes, if that's your thing. Then it brought me down to the last rabbit hole, which is VR porn. It's like computer generated pornography, which I'm also finding to be so intriguing. It's in a way like, you know, regular porn, people, okay, this is maybe a projection of my own like shyness and shame around being naked on the internet, but like maybe that's an experience that people don't have to do anymore. Or would VR porn be a space in which like takes over like porn actors' jobs? That's what I was thinking. Or will people only want pictures of real feet? They don't want computer generated feet, even though it's an option. I don't know. Anyway, I think the whole conflict that I'm thinking about is humans versus computer generated imagery, desired content. What is desired versus what is not desired versus what a computer can make versus what a human likeness actually is. And where do people fall on that spectrum? Anyways, I was curious, so I checked it out and it was very strange, but I kind of liked it.
Where do we start with this? This is interesting.
Is this kind of like This Person Does Not Exist, like that site?
Yeah, it is. I think it's connected to the same Mischief.
Mischief, yeah.
Oh, did Mischief do that first one too? I didn't know that they were.
I don't know if Mischief did the first.
We've talked about Mischief before.
It kind of reminds me of like this debate that started to spring up around digital avatars, like with Michaela and Blocko and like Brud, the studio in LA, which it's not like computer generated. You still have humans behind it, you know, like rendering out these people, but there's this legitimization of digital avatars competing in the same space as human actors. So like Michaela got signed by CAA as digital talent, right? And like is doing like adverts for like Porsche and whatever other brands, I can't remember, but like luxury kind of high-end brands. Like I think the question you brought up was really interesting around like, well, real humans have to kind of operate in these spaces still, or will we be able to like concoct virtual people of our dreams beyond like the blow up dolls that people had to kind of deal with in the 80s and 90s, like, which is interesting. It's like one of the things that I was thinking about just in the media and entertainment space is when you don't have to have an actor, you know, wait for an actor to spend like 4 months losing or gaining weight for a role, and you can just render an avatar to be the person that you want them to be.
I think I recently read that Venus of Willendorf, this like the artwork. I don't know if it was specifically that one, but there's a museum in Vienna that had put all their artwork on OnlyFans to kind of bring to light there is some like censorship over bodies in art. And I don't know if that deters from the actual signal or what you were mentioning about desire, but yeah, I think there's like this weird tension between what's allowed or how we generate things that are explicit or have nudity in them.
That conversation came up recently with this new Meek Mill artwork or whatever. that has been like on buses and things like that as being like nudity. I don't know. The censorship piece to me is like, I'm like, but I mean, I guess it matters a lot to those that think it shouldn't be out there. I'm just like not that concerned, but.
I think the thing I like about This Foot Does Not Exist is that a lot of the pictures that will come up are like really warped, weird.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say. I feel like there's this like imperfection to it, but like as compared to like Wiki Feet, for example, like those are celebrity feet, or actually not. We had a conversation about Wiki Feet before on here.
Yeah.
But then we started talking about like dating in other senses instead. With that, there's like, again, kind of this like standard of what a beautiful foot is. But I wonder, like, what are the inputs for the GANs to be generated and This Foot Does Not Exist? Like, does it include traditionally not as beautiful feet?
The thing that stood out to me a lot too is that word chameleonic, which is like not something you hear too much, but I just looked it up. And so it says, a person who often changes his or her beliefs or behavior in order to please others to succeed, which I think is really interesting, even with our last conversation on like the homogenizing, and also ties back to another GANs related conversation we had about the pizza GANs and how you just kind of will end up with like, if all of these images are being generated to succeed, whatever metric that's going to be like, maybe it's by like being used, they're just being like recognizable as feet or whatever, it's potential to have like this sort of homogenizing force, even just in terms of like imagery. So that, I don't know, like chameleonic feels very key to whatever point is being made here or question is being asked here by Mischief.
I think that the chameleonic nature for this one in particular also pertains to its utility as a meme and a nude, depending on who's looking.
True.
You know, okay, so one thing that this brought up is that like it's challenging the ideology about foot nudes or foot pics, challenge the idea about what pornographic content is. Because pornographic content, I guess by American law, is like, you know it when you see it, but you wouldn't know that a foot is a pornographic image to somebody who sees that as like a turn on, right? So like it can be a meme. It also shows, like talks about like the value of a foot picture. For somebody who is turned on by it, maybe they pay a lot of money. Some girl, like in this article, it shows some girl was paid like $500 for a picture of her feet. And then there's another article that showed that some model made $115,000 US by selling her foot pics online. But like that is something that is like not really nudity to her. Right? The thing that would have put her at risk, we can even talk about what that would be in this world. I guess people don't necessarily associate that much risk in like that type of nudity anymore, or any type of nudity. Or maybe they do, I don't know. But for her, it was nothing. She's like, I'm gonna sell these foot pics and I'm gonna get that money. You know what I mean? So the value lay mostly in the consumer. And like that means that the person who's selling can really name the price. I don't know. Anyway, so it's a weird supply-demand dynamic where like only a very interesting section of the population are going to pay a lot of money for pictures of toes. And you know what? I was really thinking like I got a nice pedicure. I might just get on Wiki.
Asia, did you know that people blur their feet out of pics and stuff? Like women blur it out because of that website? That Wiki website.
Shit! Really? Yeah. Damn.
Yeah, it's like a warning people put online. They're like, you didn't blur your feet out. Like your whatever assets are taken. The foot thing is funny too, because like from a GAN perspective, like the face thing makes a lot of sense. Like so many people take selfies just in terms of how much data you need to train some of these things. So like the idea, just looking at the foot GAN as it morphs, I'm like, oh, it's people taking a kind of foot selfies, I guess, essentially. Like that's what these photos are. Like I don't think you could do it with your hand. It's like not something that people take like pics of as much, I think. And probably also just accidentally. It's just like where the camera is located. You know, you have to be holding it with your hands. You can't like push it with your mouth or whatever to take a pic. So there's probably like ways in which like the device itself shapes the kind of fetishes we can have, you know, like feet are the thing that travel because they're the thing that can be taken a pic of that does like appear constantly in images. Like, yeah, I don't know what the deal is with the foot thing, but one thing I think of is like Roland Barthes talks about how like the most sort of sensual element of like pornography is like the gap. It's always like the gap between two pieces of clothing. That's where excitement lies. It's not nudity itself that's exciting. That's actually boring and bad or whatever in his opinion, but like eroticism lies in the fact that like there is something but then it's covered. And I guess feet make me think of that a little bit in terms of like how it ends up in lots of photos, almost like because of how we hold cameras and stuff and where we're looking.
Now I'm thinking different about my thong sandals.
Yeah.
There's like a voyeuristic thing to this. I mean, I wonder how it also like contorts the desire economy and what that means for like sex workers. Because if you don't need to have a human with like an OnlyFans account or something, or some other form of like pornography or whatever it is, again, we're kind of seeing automation hit pornography and sex work. And like people are going to lose jobs. Like, what does that mean? How does it shift when folks can get kind of whatever they want, right? Like you can have an experience that's curated for the individual in real time. And what does that start to look like?
Maybe then the desire becomes you don't get what you want.
Like but this is like this to me is such a product of like the instant gratification, like internet culture as well. And I wonder if it also if it will be like more enticing to different generations. And there will be people who kind of like in the same way where there's people who are like, I only read real books with real pages and I don't believe in Kindles. Like, will it be like that where it's like, I want the real human with the flaws versus this GAN generated thing?
I mean, is it that different from the mediation of like pornography in the first place?
Probably not.
Like that's produced. It's not real. It's not the same as sex or something. Like it's, you're watching something that's a production.
Yeah. But it's still like humans, right? Like it's still human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And the other piece is like how the like chameleonic nature of this thing kind of lends itself to like this. It didn't seem like it was permanent. Like you couldn't go back to the same. I was like Googling the site as you were talking about Asia. So like it didn't seem like you could go back to the same image over and over again. Like it was like fleeting. And I think there's something in that as well, where it's like a time bound thing. It's like, it's like stories.
Actually, like if you text the number on the thing, they'll send you a foot pic.
Yeah.
And then you could keep that in your like archives. Just like,
oh shit.
When you get into a place of like these GANs being on OnlyFans or on Pornhub, it's hard to I guess it's already hard to distinguish like ownership, because it feels like if they're being generated, are they being attributed
to who? To the GAN or to
the feet people, to the feet people who have the feet?
if it's like from Wiki feed.
Yeah, is it like
I mean, that one's trying to attribute it. I think that's interesting though too, because it's like, would you want to know who foot it is? Like even if that's your fetish or whatever, like, isn't it more interesting if who's above that foot?
But it's generated, so it's like
iPhone that connected to.
Well, like, doesn't that depend on the person? Like to Valdez's point, part of the eroticism and like the like voyeuristic nature of this is that you don't get the full picture. You just get glimpses.
Yeah, to me, what's most interesting is like, is this is it a repetition of like what was a foot fetish in the 90s or through the 20th century or whatever? It's like, does this represent some new possible thing? Like, I think the fact that it is, again, meaning it's like a continuous transformation of the imagery, like across space, like it's very strange. I had never thought about, GANs do have like, they lend themselves obviously, I guess, to an eroticism just in terms of like the morphing flesh-like vibe of all of them, like the way that they are situated and across like different latent spaces between different things, I guess. Yeah, I had never thought about what that might mean. And like, it doesn't have to invoke like a person, is what I'm getting at actually in my head. And just like, it could invoke some weird potentiality about footiness, or I don't know how to put it. We shouldn't be live. We should not be doing this live.
We are, and
hey man, ain't nothing wrong with some toes, man. Let's think we had
in the comments. In the comments here, Illustrator says, I think it is part of the fetish to know the person as it can be for the shape of the idea of that part, or the idea of that part specifically. And Rod Skimmons, what's up, Todd, said this relates to the current push to decriminalize sex work and the underground support by some politicians who patron workers. True. Yeah, that's interesting.
There's a Pornhub classics where that's right. So I was going with the art stuff. It's that you can like go through this repository of like art that's restricted on Pornhub. So I'm wondering if like there would be like a Pornhub gone where you can just go through these risque generated images.
Yo, and it's funny you should say that. And for to steal this idea piece of the segment of the show, OnlyGans is what that should be called. And steal that idea. I like that. Also, to me, the interesting question brought up here is around like AI understanding values, which is like, I think part of the like this like natural cultural language recognition piece that needs to happen was like, if this is true that if you know porn when you see it, as they say, which I think maybe we need to challenge to begin with, but I think we all feel that way, but maybe we don't all agree and see eye to eye about that. But if that's the case, like, can a computer tell classical nude art from porn, from feet fetish material, from Meek Mill marketing on a bus or whatever? And I mean, people obviously disagree about like what's the explainability, AI explainability of the value systems that go into like determining which box to put that in or which, tag to tag that visual information with.
So that's part of a wider debate of just being able to code human behavior, right? Like the threshold for like porniness, I think, is different whether it's living in a coastal city in California versus like being in this, the southern part of the United States. What is indecent or censored or pornographic, I think changes over time as you move.
Yeah, and context too. The stuff around like breastfeeding, like on Instagram.
True. And sorry, just to jump back for a second to correct something. I may have read Illis Preach's comment too quickly, but it is part of the fetish to not know the person as it can be for this shape or the idea of that part. I think maybe I said it too quickly and didn't make that clear. So signal and noise, follow this?
Well, I think that comment is great because it's like, initially the first thing I was going to say was like all sex is like virtual. Like there's no like separate thing called virtual sex. Like we all like are engaged in acts of imagination. Like it would be nightmarish not to. Like it's like it has to entail some degree of just like your own imaginative capacity. And so to me the question is like, or the interesting question, at least for me, is like, do any of these examples and technologies enable you to like heighten that imaginative capacity? To me the GAN thing, like possibly, whereas like the sort of traditional VR thing, I think is a little, it's almost like the first thing like a teenage boy thinks of when they think of VR, like, or it might even be the reason VR exists in the first place. It's like, it comes from that. But in general, I don't think it heightens like that intensity of virtual like capacity or imaginative capacity. That's just how I'll frame it. So yeah, I think that first one's a great signal.
Maisie?
Yeah, I also agree with the GANs aspect, just like the morphing element of it and opening up our definitions of what's desirable or, like what we want to see with our own fetishes to include like grotesque elements. Yeah, so I think the GANs aspect was most interesting to me in terms of opening up what we deem as desirable.
Radha? Yeah,
I was going to kind of say a similar thing, but I think it's signal in the sense of how it augments the language of what we find desirous. And yeah, I'm a little bit less interested in like the censorship, like the kind of the censorship, what is pornography aspect of things, though, because I think that's been a debate that's been going on for a long time.
Erica? Signal and noise.
Yeah, I think at this point, feet have come up like more than once. It is a signal. But I think the piece about generally everything that everyone said about like a gone in desire, but also, what am I trying to say? The idea that it wouldn't be necessary for a sex, like a group of people, I guess, because the images are being generated, that you wouldn't need people per se in those instances, that there's like a generated image that's replacing people, is interesting to me. And then also how it circulates and the other spaces that those generated images end up circulating and how they build meaning there is also really weird. Outside of like a Wikifeet situation, which is like a repository and dedicated space, when you get into like how those images end up traveling and trickling into other spheres, it gets really weird.
Signal. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a signal for me.
Yeah, I think it's kind of strong signal. Like the whole territory is very interesting, and like there's so much I don't know, and I'm curious about learning. So I'll put it strong signal. Fathers, what's your weakest signal?
There's this thing going on in France since about like 2013, I guess, and it's like a pilot program somewhere outside of Paris, and it's for a form of what's called like contributory income. So it's an alternative to basic income, universal basic income. So contributory income is also universal, like it's granted to everybody in that region or whatever where it's being piloted. But one of the issues with like basic income is that I guess it leaves aside the question of what kind of society we want. It kind of just delegates that out to like every single individual on their own. It doesn't really address any of the issues around how markets shape what you're actually able to do and how you can contribute. And so a contributory income is actually like granted on the basis of you using it for some kind of self-development that allows you to contribute back to society in some way. And so I just find the idea very interesting. It opens up like lots of questions around, like, obviously this is not like the most appealing thing to like a classically liberal perspective that would want everything to be about individual choice. Like there's a way that you're constrained in what you can do with it. But I don't know how constrained you are. Like what it makes me think of is like companies now. It's like obviously very common for companies to give out money for different forms of self-development. So if they can do it, why shouldn't governments be able to do that in some form? It's not as like out there or bureaucratically difficult as it seems, I think. And I think the question is like, yeah, how do you determine what counts as socially beneficial and whatnot? In my opinion, that could probably be pretty open, but I'm not sure how they're thinking about it. And there's like an artist union that exists in Paris, and during COVID, the union, because of all the dues they had accrued, like continued paying all of its members, but what they were paid for was their own like self-development during that time, because they couldn't put on shows. Public shows were not available. So it's sort of similar to that idea. I mean, that's what a sort of universal basic income would be anyway, too.
Sure.
It's like the same idea. It's just like there's a limit that you have to do it in a way that contributes to your development and stuff.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess these types of things can happen in a way through like taxes and stuff like that as well for certain people and professions and things. Like it becomes more of a discount on your taxes or whatever, something you can write off.
Yeah.
It's just a little different though. Like it changes things for sure. I was going to say, I swear I read a story that I believe was when the French government had paid out a arts and culture payment to everyone under 20 or something, or under 25. And it was like, you got a certain amount of money, $100 or $60 or something, whatever it was, to spend on anything arts and culture. It's just like for enrichment and to support the arts. And it was like everyone was buying comic books and mangas, and that was it. And there was like this news story about like that they were kind of like disappointed that was all that was happening or whatever. But it was like, why not?
I think that's great.
Yeah, spend it.
So there's only a certain amount of things that they could spend money on.
In some way, there has to be that, yeah. But I'm not sure, like, to what extent that's like how big that is and whatnot.
How is it different than like a grant system?
Well, it's unconditional. A grant would be, I imagine, depending on like you apply for something you want to do and then you get money to do it. And this also implies that literally everyone has something to contribute, right? That's like the underlying idea, is that you should develop something that you can contribute back with.
I think it's pretty cool with something like the arts. Like it makes sense. It seems to like you have broad enough definition, and that's like a joy that everyone should have access to and to participate in.
Kind of maybe just speaks to the value systems of different governments. Is that when I used to work for the city of Toronto, I became aware of how people who are on welfare are regulated on how they could spend the money that they're given. And how restrictive that is for a lot of people, and how like their caseworkers like would surveil them to make sure that they're spending the money that's given to them, which is like not really even a lot of money, but on the things that they deem valuable for their families. Like, this is not necessarily comparing to France at all, but I just think it's interesting how like different governments or different policies seek to direct how people manage the funds that they get from them in their own lives for the purpose and benefit of the society for which they think is the best, or for which their policy thinks is the best way to serve the unit and then also the community at large. So I was like, maybe I wish a lot of governments were more like France, but I'm also just like, sometimes I'll be thinking, damn, we are all in some system, y'all. Yeah, that's what it reminded me of a little bit.
Asia, I thought of like very similar things, and those like things are like notorious and like ridiculous, and they're also often introduced by people who oppose the payments to those, or the redistributive ways that that's actually induced. So it's like people who are like, who want to get rid of it but can't, and so go about doing something to make it very hard to try to get as few people to jump through all the hurdles and actually like access the money that they should otherwise be granted. So I totally agree.
I was going to ask actually, is like, what do folks end up spending that money on? Like, what is deemed a valuable contribution back to society in that way?
I think people go like study random subjects and stuff like that, stuff that they're like curious about. It's not like a volunteering bursary or something like that. It's not like you go do work. Like, I think it's meant to be maybe closer to self-development as like an idea. I think that's quite common.
It's
I
just
imagine
interesting.
like different practical skills, like, yeah, like carpentry. I mean, lots of like night schools and stuff offer that kind of stuff. You can do it quite cheap, even in like Toronto.
It's interesting, like, kind of just thinking about the like what is valued or what's valuable. And when you were talking right now, is like, you know, depending on where you're sitting or like what kind of culture you're part of. Here it's like, okay, maybe like self-care, you know, going to this, like spending that money on like a spa day or like therapy or whatever it is the valuable kind of contribution, versus if you go to another culture where it's like actually giving up your own comfort for the collective good and kind of like sacrificing your own well-being in some way, and, you know, contributing in that manner is what is seen as like valuable and seen as like a good use of your time and money. That to me was kind of interesting. It also reminded me of this scheme that one of my German friends had told me about, which was, and this is like, I don't know if it's still around, but it was like in the 90s, like after high school, you were encouraged to take a year, like a gap year, and basically take that year to like dive into, you know, you would go and like work at a preschool or like work at like a community garden or something that was meant to kind of enrich your life experience and then like get you ready to like go out into the world before you went to university. So it reminded me a little bit of that. And that was also like kind of government mandated, government funded and incentivized.
Yeah, that's a great example. That's like exactly the kind of like, it's uncomfortable for like traditionally like liberal cultures to think about something like this, because it is like them stepping in to say like, hey, here's like a thing that we think is socially good that you should do. Spend a year of your life somewhere. But in a lot of ways, we already do that implicitly with like the way education's set up, the way like there are a lot of like things that I think we don't realize like are actually already determined and we accept it.
What's the scenario that you would like extrapolate from the signal?
There's like stranger elements about this one that I don't really understand yet. So he actually wants to create, the guy who's running it, it's like a philosopher, wants to create contributory territories, and he compares them to like free trade zones and wants to get them to have some kind of, I don't really get that side of it, but just like there is some model for it. I don't know if that means for it to expand somehow or for it to like attract people into its zone. I'm not entirely sure, but I think that would probably add a layer of what this could like result in that could be interesting. Comparative zones of contributory models and whatnot.
Interesting. I don't have any idea what that might mean. But.
That reminds me of like work study visas.
Right.
Like, you know, countries having agreements so that youth will have access to work in another country more easily. Is that like what he's trying to do in terms of like incentivizing people contributing back to society to different territories? Or
I love that idea of like, I know there are actually like a fair, it's maybe not that common, there are a fair amount of like countries that do host like different exchanges for like researchers and stuff like that. And they'll like, I think Japan does it with like a few different, becoming more common would be great. I don't think that's how he meant it, but maybe.
It sounds like the territories are based off of what the government then would deem as economic growth, or like what would be economically viable, and that's how they determine it. But you haven't mentioned that. So, but usually I feel like when those programs are kind of developed, they have some sort of index or indicator guideline of what economic growth or skill development looks like. I think we've kind of mentioned that a little bit, but I think that's where it gets a little bit trickier.
Signal noise, Erica?
I'm going to say signal because I think it's a few of the things we've tracked, but in other situations, I'm trying to think. I need a moment to think about it, actually.
Okay, we'll come back.
Sorry.
I mean, I like it to be a signal towards like, allowing resources for people to do more purposeful things with their lives, but also like not being very prescriptive and restrictive about it. So I like for it to be a signal of that, and just like different way of thinking about universal basic income.
True. Asia?
I'm gonna say signal because what I think I like about it is that policymakers there recognize the importance of providing funding for people to choose the type of, I guess you could say, creative avenue in a way that enriches their own lives. That as a policy directive, I feel like is a signal.
Mm-hmm. Rada?
Yeah, I do think it's a signal in the way that like a government is thinking about providing a service for its citizens, that if you invest in the individual, you can kind of enhance the experience for the collective. The one question for me as part of this is like, is it just based on like you have residence in a particular country, or does it require you to be a citizen of that country to opt into that scheme? And what does that mean for the people who maybe like aren't citizens of France but still reside there?
Yeah, the like borderless network version of this would be very cool for sure. I like that. Yeah, I'm into it. I'm about it. I like this a lot. I hope we have more of this in the world. I'm sort of like, is that just like, I feel like there are, people with different politics who are so against this type of government spending. So, and I think this would be like a signal depending on your context. If you're like a policymaker, this could be definitely a strong signal. But I to Valdez's point, I think it exists in so many ways already. So in some way, that way it's like the reframe is useful and we can look at it, but I'm saying noise. Erica, what's your weakest signal?
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say that I think it's a signal just because of this, of any kind of incentivization that a government's thinking about. And yeah, just generally planning for some sort of universal basic income. But yeah, I would be curious to know what those territories are kind of how those are mapped out. I think I have more questions about that. Yeah, sorry.
I think when we have unanimous signals from now on, we should just, that automatically makes it noise. But since it's like your colleagues are supposed to disagree on these things. Anyways, Erica, what's yours?
I've had some thinkings around digital witchcraft for a little while. It seems to generally be about the way technology science kind of fall under this category of witchcraft, or how digital tools are being used for spiritual and creative expression. I can think of a handful of events, particularly that fall under this category. Specifically over the past few years, 2 years, Witch Talk is one, which is on TikTok, kind of advocating hexing the moon, 3D printed talismans, and then sigil and fortune telling memes are just like a few things that I think kind of encompass digital witchcraft. But specifically, there's this Digital Witchcraft Institute, and it's basically a project that organizes around, so they say, sacred interoperability to fix the spiritual crisis. Yeah, so my signal is digital witchcraft.
Tell us more about the Institute.
Yeah, so I guess the areas of research are around post-human tech, deep migrations, and climate justice. So it's a little bit, just like to name a few, some things around like magical thinking, social dreaming, decolonization, terraforming, and contagion. Those are just a few of the things they've described, but it reminds me a lot of the ways that witchcraft, I guess, is described like long before like this, I guess the 16th 17th century, where there's just like non-conforming practices around technology and science, but it's called the Digital Witchcraft Institute.
This could be the Digital Witchcraft podcast. I think it's a whole sub theme. Yeah.
I guess just in the past, we've kind of hit a few things between where the overlaps between magic and technology. I know you mentioned that as well, Rob, but how magic isn't or isn't technology, even in the case of it being mediation, maybe. But from what I was reading, it looks like this idea of magic disappeared or kind of got lost with Enlightenment, like the scientific revolution, the Industrial Revolution. So I'm just wondering if it's an indication that if like institutes like this and these like few events are indications that that's changing, if it's about technology, if it's more about, I guess, ritual.
Yeah, I mean, the vast number of like themes within this concept here is very interesting, right? Like, if you had asked me 10 years ago whether I associated witchcraft with decolonization, like planetary boundaries of like environmentalism, terraforming, and even wellness, I think I would maybe not have seen the connections very obviously. Now it's incredibly obvious just based on sort of the cultural atmosphere of like these different signals that you're bringing up. And like, that's just interesting how this idea of witchcraft exists in the cultural imagination, at least I speak like personally, has changed a lot over time.
I think I might have mentioned it before. I came across this page called Data Healing on Instagram. And it's like a Black woman leading this, like, I guess you could say Instagram page, but also just like a thought process around the internet and as a place of revolution and harm and healing, and like using like digital vocabulary to talk about like healing trauma. And I think that's what your signal reminds me of that. But the other thing that your signal reminds me of is in Ghana, I became aware of this thing called Sakawa. It's like internet fraud, but like it's mixed with African traditional rituals to enhance its efficacy. So they're not going to just like, you know, make up a fake Facebook account and like try to like scam somebody's mom out of money. They'll make the Facebook account, try to scam someone's mom out of money, but also do a ritual to increase the likelihood of it working. And I think that that's a really interesting way of, or like the idea is that witchcraft works in the digital space, and like that those things are not separate just because one is more traditional, one is more digital. Like the witchcraft space is and can have an impact on digital spaces. And I was thinking like, dang, why not though? Of course it could and would if you believe in it. You know what I mean? Or if like you see meaning in the way that things outcome, if you, I don't know, for me, manifestation is real. So I'm gonna just leave it at that.
That reminds me of, just briefly, that reminds me of just kind of the thinking around Obia in general as like Caribbean Black magic. It gets the like stigma of scam, and in some cases it is, but that there is then this a community dedicated to like certain kinds of techniques and healing and like DIY medicine in their community. So it's twofold, I think.
I also wanted to mention that there's this healer put me onto, I think it's called astro.com. Basically this website where you would put in like, you know, first of all, wait, before we say that, have you guys seen the memes that are be like, if she asks you for your birth time, it's a huge red flag? Yeah. So basically on this website, you would put in your information, and like if you want to see like your compatibility with a partner, you put their information. It's kind of like, what was that app that everybody was using for 5 minutes? Pattern.
Pattern.
Yes. Anyway, back to what I was saying. Astro.com, basically if you put your information in there, they will come up with this like map of the world that will show you the places that are most useful for your personal growth, or like that would be the most challenging for you based on like your sun and Neptune and all this type of shit. So I think that this is also an interesting space of how people allow their destiny of their lives to be impacted by the things that are computer generated.
Yeah, level of like divination.
Yes, divination through digital means, and how that might influence somebody's choices. So anyway, this healer lady did this for me. And then she's like, girl, you're not supposed to be living in Ghana. You're supposed to be living in Togo. And I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I'll go check it out.
That is interesting. It reminds me of like even the app CoStar, and like one of their big kind of like advertising moments is like we're using NASA data to source, to intuit kind of these insights about you. But then on the flip side, it totally reminds me of like birth charts and like lunar charts that are generated, at least like for me, it's like when I was born, my dad went and got, you know, our horoscopes and lunar charts and birth charts like sorted. Even though he didn't believe in it, there was an aspect of just like culturally, this is what you do, so that you know if your child's going to be okay and like if they're going to be wealthy and successful and like whatever the metrics of success are in like Indian culture. And so like that's kind of interesting. It also makes me think about this thing called Haunted Machines, which was put together by Tobias Rovell and Natalie Kane. And it's like, it's a similar thing where they're talking about just like, you know, do we think of technology as magical because we don't understand that like digital prowess? Or is it just kind of like this whole notion of like ghost in the machine? And if you think about just like the lineage of like technological advancement and who was seen as being the fanatic or the people that were really kind of like at the forefront of whatever their technology was, there's an element of like alienation and kind of like operating at the edges that is interesting, right? And there's like a lineage that you can draw back to religion and people that believe that the earth was flat and kind of all of that as well.
It makes me think of like synchronicities that we notice in our lives and the way we feel when we have those. I think of synchronicities like there's sort of almost like one of the basic human experiences that tend towards the sort of the spiritual or the cosmic, that, you know, this like sense that there are forces working that are more powerful, that are causing these like things that seem like more than coincidences to happen, and that we find meaning that may justify like certain decisions we might make and so on. And certainly like things like tarot cards, horoscopes, all of those are for finding those types of synchronicities in lives and like an extra element that you added into. But I always think it's so interesting, and maybe there's some kind of conflation going on right now with like the algorithm, the suggesting recommendation algorithms that we're using like across, and that all of these things are sharing data across. And it is also producing more and more of these sort of synchronicities. That person said this, you know, and you can try to be as aware of it as possible, but it's hard to know where you might be missing that, where you might be finding meaning where there is none, and that sort of thing. So there's something in that is like, this is fascinating. This is maybe, some of this could be like dangerous. And then I also wanted to just point out that CoStar like took the NASA data piece. It's like, it almost feels like a very like classical, like pseudoscientific strategy to use, right? It's like, with science, now let's like,
there's real like, data. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that like, even with an algorithmic approach to this, you have to ask yourself like, who's constructing those algorithms and like, where is the information being sourced from?
And the data healing stuff is totally dealing with exactly the questions like we're bringing up among many others. So like, it's not at all like sort of blind to the ways that these things are happening. It's, as far as I understand it, pretty much about that and how to deal with that.
Stop using your enlightenment thinking on this topic. I actually agree with your interpretation. It makes a lot of sense to me. Like, well, I'll say I agree with what you're saying. I don't think it explains everything in terms of like what's going on and as a signal and whatnot. But I agree that like I would probably see that whole trend towards digital witchcraft as an after effect of a transition to like a new media form, being like digital networks and stuff like that. In the same way that in the early 20th century, like seances became huge because the telephone and the phonograph emerged. And for the first time, human voices could be separated from bodies. Like, we forget how wild that must have been to people who grew up in a time when a voice could never be separated from a body, and all of a sudden you could do it. So of course the first thing people do is go look and try to find ghosts and stuff like that, right? If voices are technologically separable. And I think probably something like that, and synchronicity, and like ways of like, we do have like the power in our pockets that like might have been only accessible to like a military in terms of like coordinating people in space.
Or a wizard.
Yeah, it's a wizards, like, yeah, 30,
Only
40 years
wizards have
ago.
them. Yeah.
So I could see stuff like that being a good interpretation. The only other thing I wanted to add, like I opened with a joke about the Enlightenment, just because I'm sure there are different strands of magic. Like I don't really know much about the history, but I know that within the Enlightenment there was like a strand of actual, at least like alchemy and stuff like that was a way of like actually doing science like before the more codified forms of experimentation and all that stuff like started to emerge. Like a lot of like occult groups were like key, like the Rosicrucians in particular were like key to getting the Enlightenment off the ground. So I just don't want to like dichotomize the two as though, one is irrational and the other is rational.
I also wonder whether it's like another way to have some language to articulate like the want to invoke change within like technological field that's like that has very dominant narratives. And yeah, like witchcraft as a way to like bring back a sense of agency. And there's like growing communities where there's a felt sense of connection that in a way like makes like hard technology feel a little bit more inclusive, but also like that there could be like a critical element to it. So I don't know. I think maybe it provides like language to articulate like the sense of wanting to reclaim and thinking about like misnarratives that should be part of how we think about technology.
How ritual, I guess, is a point of social change is what I kind of gathered from that. Yeah.
Who's the quote from? The technology cannot be separated from magic if it's beyond what you can understand. It's like a famous
wasn't
sci-fi
that Arthur
writer.
C. Clarke or
That's
something?
it. It's Arthur
Yeah.
C. Clarke.
Yeah.
That's it's like an interesting thing, and I don't even know like how kids conceive of like Siri and stuff like that. As it like as a person, as like a divine thing or something else. Well, signal or noise, Radha?
I think it's signal. I think there's something interesting about there, like the agency piece that Macy was bringing up, and then also just this divination element to it that I think is really intriguing and has some like degree of novelty. So I'll say signal.
Macy?
I guess it's like a strong signal to me. I think it's just like how different types of voices are making use of online spaces to create safe spaces for specific communities online, to be able to like have ways to utilize technology that could facilitate just like embracing aspects of identity, ways of sharing information, and like creating networks that's like bringing out voices that has been like less dominant within how technology has been like thought about and has been made, or decisions have been made about the tools that we use. So yeah, I think it's like a strong signal for me.
About this?
Oh, tricky. I don't know. I don't think it's a signal of like us or seeing technology a different way or like making it in a different way. Like I don't think there's anything, to me at least, like, but in regards to like, yeah, how we develop technology or something, I find that like quite, I guess, far-fetched to imagine as like a way to generate community in particular ways. I could definitely see as like an after effect of like the strange way that digital networks make synchronicities and forms of like social power that we didn't realize it was actually doing, and like kind of exceeds our capacity to even conceptualize, what we're living in. I could see that as well. But that to me makes it like more of like an after effect or a symptom. I don't know. I remember like Starhawk and stuff in the 90s. I know that's like quite different, but through the 80s and 70s and 90s, it just reminds me a lot of like the eco-pagan movement. I feel like there's like cyclical returns of that personally I don't see like that cresting into some mainstream thing. I think I still see it as like a kind of edge thing that'll maybe always be there.
Asia? Signal and noise.
I think I kind of agree with Valdis in a sense that witchcraft on the internet is not necessarily new. I do think that there's something about, like, at least from my idea about what it could mean, like the Ouija boardness of the internet is like a space that is, people have been doing that for a long time. But I think what's interesting about the signal is the extent to which witchcraft on the internet is being directed towards climate change and towards like social issues that are very salient for literally all of us, but also specifically for the communities that are engaged in it. Like they're engaging in witchcraft on the internet to impact social change. And I think that that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Did that come up in the comment? Did I miss that? That's so strange.
We talked a bit about it, and we didn't really get deep into it. But yeah, Erica mentioned like terraforming and stuff as part of this. Yeah, there's like a whole ecological side.
Yeah, part of their areas of research were climate justice, deep migrations, and post-human tech.
Yeah, to me, it's definitely a signal, but I'm not confident. Like I understand it very well, what it's going to mean, what it's going to be. I do think I understand like the essential like need or whatever for this type of thinking, and like right now, and I think probably fits with like the time of chaos, as Macy was saying, like the need for agency, the need for a bit of control or feeling that you have influence. I get it that way, but I'm not convinced that that's just all it is. I think there could be more to it, and that it's hard to know whether there will be really interesting ways of understanding technology that will actually be useful, that will shape our culture. But it seems like some of that could totally happen, especially in like these movements like data healing, or like it ties against Traumagati is like another one that's very like witchcraft and spells that we've talked about on here. So I definitely see that as a signal. So a quick abracadabra for protection from the scammers and hackers. Broadcast from later.